The woods had learned how to keep secrets long before anyone thought to ask them questions. In the deepest folds of the Appalachian Mountains, where fog clung to the trees like a warning and roads dissolved into dirt and memory, there stood a cluster of homes that never appeared on proper maps. People lived there quietly, born, married, and buried beneath the same canopy of twisted branches, untouched by lawmen, journalists, or time itself. Outsiders who passed too close felt it immediately, the sense that something was watching, not from the trees, but from the past. The story did not begin with a crime. It began with a birth. Then another. And another. 4 children, all brought into the world by the same woman, each arriving in silence, each wrapped in secrecy so thick it felt rehearsed. No father's name was spoken aloud. No questions were welcomed. In a place where families shared land, blood, and graves, silence was a kind of currency, and fear was its keeper. The old man was always there. He was known as the backbone of the family, the one whose word settled disputes and whose presence ended conversations. To strangers, he looked like any other mountain patriarch, stooped, weathered, slow-moving, his eyes dulled by age. But within the walls of the home, his shadow stretched long and unchallenged. Children lowered their heads when he entered a room. Adults spoke his name carefully, as if it might hear them even when he was gone. Something was wrong with the children, people whispered. Not sick, not exactly, but different. Their faces carried familiar features too closely aligned, like reflections folded into one another. Neighbors noticed but never lingered on the thought. In the mountains, curiosity could be dangerous, and asking the wrong question could make a person disappear into the trees without so much as a farewell. Years later, when fragments of the truth finally surfaced, they did so reluctantly through damaged records, half-burned journals, and the trembling voice of someone who had waited a lifetime to speak. What emerged was not just a family secret, but a horror rooted so deeply it had shaped generations. A bloodline twisted inward on itself, protected by isolation, obedience, and fear. The settlement existed beyond the reach of ordinary notice, tucked so deeply into the Appalachian wilderness that even seasoned locals struggled to describe its exact location. There were no road signs pointing toward it, no official boundaries marking where it began or ended, only a thinning of gravel roads into mud tracks and then into nothing at all. Those who lived there rarely traveled beyond the surrounding ridges, and when they did, they spoke little of home. Generations had passed in that isolation, creating a community shaped not by written law or outside oversight, but by habit, fear, and unwritten rules enforced by elders whose authority went unquestioned. Modern systems never fully reached the settlement. Births were often handled by midwives rather than hospitals, deaths recorded in family Bibles instead of government offices, and marriages conducted quietly without licenses or witnesses beyond blood relatives. This absence of documentation was not accidental, it was a survival mechanism. The people learned early that remaining unseen meant remaining undisturbed. Outsiders brought questions, and questions brought consequences. Over time, secrecy became tradition, passed down as carefully as land and names. The landscape itself reinforced the separation. Dense forests wrapped around the homes like walls, and the mountains acted as natural barriers that discouraged travel in and out. Weather could cut the settlement off for weeks, sometimes months, and when that happened, the outside world felt theoretical, almost imaginary. Radios crackled but rarely worked, newspapers arrived late if they arrived at all, and stories of cities and laws felt like myths meant for other people. Children grew up believing the mountain was the entire world, and everything beyond it was dangerous or corrupt. Authority within the settlement did not come from badges or courts but from lineage. Certain families carried weight simply because they always had, and their elders were treated as final arbiters of right and wrong. Disputes were settled internally, often harshly, and anyone who threatened to involve outsiders was shamed or quietly driven away. The community policed itself through silence, ensuring that nothing damaging ever traveled beyond the tree line. When outsiders eventually stumbled upon the settlement, it was not through intention but accident. A broken-down vehicle, a wrong turn, a hunting trail followed too far. Those who encountered the people there often described an immediate unease, a sense that they were intruding on something old and guarded. Conversations felt measured, eyes lingered too long, and questions were met with rehearsed vagueness. The settlement appeared poor but orderly, quiet but tense, as if every structure and every person was part of an arrangement designed to keep something hidden, something that had survived precisely because no one had been looking. The whispers began in fragments, never spoken loudly and never traced back to a single source. They moved through the settlement the way smoke slips through cracks, impossible to contain and just as difficult to prove. At first, it was nothing more than quiet curiosity about a woman who never seemed to have a husband yet kept giving birth. In a place where marriage was considered essential and lineage was openly discussed, her situation stood out. People noticed how no man ever claimed the children, how no wedding followed the pregnancies, and how questions about the father were gently, but firmly, discouraged. As time passed, the pattern became harder to ignore. One child might have been dismissed as misfortune or secrecy, but four forced the community to confront an unspoken truth. The births followed no visible relationships, no courtship, no absence of a man returning from work or travel. Instead, the same elderly figure was always present, hovering on the edges of these moments, offering instructions, arranging silence, ensuring the midwife said as little as possible. Some began to sense that the answer they were not allowed to speak was far darker than simple shame. The rumors grew more specific as memories were compared in private. People recalled how the woman never appeared afraid during her pregnancies, only withdrawn, as if fear had long since settled into something heavier. They noticed how the children shared unmistakable features not just with each other, but with someone far older. Similar eyes, similar jawlines, the same unsettling expression that seemed to belong to a previous generation. These observations were never voiced openly, but they lingered in the minds of those who saw them. Silence was enforced not through threats, but through example. Those who had once asked too many questions had vanished from gatherings, moved away suddenly, or become subjects no one spoke about anymore. The message was clear without being stated: some truths were not meant to survive exposure. Even so, the whispers persisted, fueled by late-night conversations, shared glances, and the growing discomfort that something deeply unnatural was being protected. What made the rumors especially disturbing was how ordinary they began to feel. Over time, the unspoken became normalized, folded into daily life as another thing that simply was. Children were warned not to repeat what they overheard. Adults trained themselves to look away. The woman continued her life under watchful eyes, and the children grew up within a cloud of quiet suspicion. The community did not need confirmation to understand what was happening. The truth was already present, circulating just beneath the surface, heavy with implication and dread. The first real cracks in the silence appeared not through confession, but through paper. When an outsider finally gained limited access to local records, what they found was not evidence of order, but of careful disorder. Birth certificates were missing entirely or filed years late, names were crossed out and rewritten in different ink, and dates that should have followed a natural sequence instead overlapped or contradicted one another. Entire decades seemed to blur together, as if time itself had been intentionally smudged to prevent clear understanding. Church ledgers, often considered the most reliable records in isolated communities, told an equally troubling story. Baptisms were recorded without fathers listed, or with vague references such as guardian or head of household instead of proper names. In several entries, the same man's name appeared repeatedly, but always in roles that stopped just short of formal acknowledgement. He sponsored baptisms, signed as a witness, or appeared as the person presenting the child to the congregation, yet was never identified as the parent. The repetition felt deliberate, a pattern hidden in plain sight. Marriage records raised even more questions. The woman at the center of the mystery was never officially married, yet she was never marked as abandoned or widowed, labels commonly used in the settlement. Instead, her status remained curiously undefined, as if someone had decided that clarity itself was dangerous. In one ledger, her name appeared under a different spelling, while in another, her birth year shifted by several years, making it harder to align her age with the timeline of the pregnancies. Even death records were altered. Infants who died young were sometimes recorded twice under slightly different names, while others vanished from documentation altogether. This made it nearly impossible to establish how many children had truly been born into the family. The inconsistencies were not random, They followed a logic of concealment, suggesting someone with authority had overseen the process. In a community where literacy was limited, only a handful of people could manipulate records this thoroughly, and all of them were deeply connected to the same family. As these documents were compared side by side, the illusion of coincidence collapsed. The gaps aligned too perfectly, the alterations too consistent. It became clear that the records were not simply poorly kept, but intentionally engineered to obscure relationships that would have been impossible to justify. Each crossed-out name and missing date acted like a fingerprint, marking the presence of a long-running effort to erase the truth without ever fully destroying it. What remained was a trail of evidence defined more by what was absent than by what was written. The missing pieces spoke louder than the preserved ones, revealing a system built to confuse anyone who came looking too closely. The paper trail did not expose the truth directly, but it made one thing unmistakably clear: something had happened that required generations of careful correction, and the people responsible had believed that if the records were broken enough, the story itself would never be fully told. The first breakthrough came from someone who had lived at the edges of the family's world but had never been fully absorbed into it, a midwife who had quietly delivered many of the children and seen things no outsider would ever imagine. Her memories were fragmented, pieced together over decades, yet they carried a weight that no document or rumor could replicate. She spoke slowly, each word measured, as if the air itself might carry her secrets away, leaving only silence in its place. She remembered the woman's pregnancies, the pattern of secrecy surrounding them, and the ever-present figure of the old man who hovered nearby during each birth. At the time, she had assumed there were reasons no one shared, reasons too private to question, yet the details now painted a picture far darker than anyone could have anticipated. The midwife recalled subtle signs that went unnoticed by those untrained in reading human behavior, gestures, expressions, and the unnatural familiarity between the children and the older man. He would check on the newborns more than any grandfather normally would, his touch lingering, his eyes lingering longer. The mother, while outwardly composed, displayed a peculiar calm that was neither joy nor fear but something more resigned, a quiet acceptance that she could not and perhaps would not ever escape. The midwife remembered small exchanges between them, glances that spoke volumes without words, and the way the community seemed to look away, pretending not to notice what was happening right in front of them. She also noted the children themselves, even as infants, carried subtle markers of shared lineage that went beyond mere resemblance. Certain facial structures, the curve of a jaw, the tilt of an eye, repeated in ways that suggested patterns impossible under ordinary circumstances. While the community chalked it up to coincidence, the midwife had always been uneasy, her intuition whispering that these patterns pointed to something forbidden. She had whispered to herself the questions she dared not ask aloud, understanding that in that environment, curiosity was dangerous. Years later, after decades of silence, the midwife began to speak, her recollections igniting the first spark of clarity. She described events in meticulous detail, framing them in a way that made the impossible believable. The pattern was undeniable. The children's father had not been a husband, a cousin, or even a neighbor. The evidence pointed to a single, disturbing truth: that the figure at the center of the home, the grandfather, had played a role that went far beyond traditional family boundaries. Her words, tremulous yet resolute, began to unravel the carefully constructed silence, confirming what the whispers had only hinted at for generations. Every anecdote she provided, every small observation, chipped away at the community's protective facade, revealing the depths of a secret so unnatural that it had been deliberately hidden, even from those who lived closest to it. The revelation hit like a thunderclap that no one in the settlement could ignore. It began as murmurs, half-formed thoughts shared in the safety of dimly lit rooms, and quickly grew into a truth that refused to be hidden. The man who had always been the quiet, unassuming patriarch, the one whose presence had shaped every decision and silenced every question, was revealed to be far more than a figure of authority or tradition. He was the father of the children, not in any socially acceptable sense, but biologically, and the connection was as impossible as it was horrifying. He was their mother's own grandfather. The realization twisted through the community like a cold wind, leaving shock and disbelief in its wake. Generations of secrecy had relied on a carefully maintained pattern of obedience and fear. Neighbors had long suspected that something unusual connected the children to the old man, but no one could articulate it without risking their own safety or social standing. The truth, when it surfaced, did not arrive gently. It came through pieced-together testimony, genetic hints, and the long-forgotten journals of those who had lived close enough to observe the family without being fully absorbed into its rules. As each fragment of evidence aligned, the nightmare became clear. The mother's children were the product of a relationship that defied every boundary, a union that the settlement's isolation had allowed to continue unchallenged for years. The community reacted with a mixture of horror, denial, and a grim recognition of what had always lurked in the shadows. Some were unable to speak, their minds recoiling from the knowledge they had unconsciously sensed but never confronted. Others, more practical or hardened by mountain life, understood that this secret had existed precisely because the world outside could not or would not intervene. It was a truth so grotesque that it redefined the very nature of the family, erasing any notion of normalcy and replacing it with a legacy of fear, control, and taboo. The children themselves were unknowingly entwined in this history, their lives shaped by an invisible force that dictated relationships, social hierarchy, and the boundaries of what could be questioned. Even as they grew, the pattern repeated subtly in their interactions, in their deference to authority, and in the ways the family maintained cohesion through silence. The grandfather's influence was absolute, extending beyond discipline into the very foundation of bloodlines, and it was this control that allowed the horrific truth to remain hidden for decades. Understanding the full weight of this revelation meant confronting not only the unnatural lineage but also the mechanisms that had allowed it to persist. The patriarch's role was not merely biological, it was systemic, a deliberate manipulation of secrecy, fear, and tradition that ensured the settlement itself remained complicit. This knowledge shattered the illusion of innocence, revealing a darkness that had been nurtured, protected, and meticulously hidden behind the facade of family and mountain life. Even before the full truth was revealed, neighbors had noticed something about the children that unsettled them in ways they could neither name nor fully understand. It wasn't illness, nor was it behavior that could be chalked up to bad manners or poor upbringing. The unease came from subtle, almost imperceptible traits that threaded through the family line like a shadow. Features repeated too precisely from one child to another, eyes set in the same unsettling angle, expressions that seemed older than their age, gestures mirrored across siblings with uncanny similarity. These patterns were impossible to ignore once observed, yet the settlement maintained a tense silence, as though acknowledging them aloud might summon consequences the community preferred to avoid. Conversations about the children were whispered, shared in hushed tones among trusted neighbors, and quickly abandoned when the topic proved too uncomfortable. Adults remarked quietly on the uncanny resemblance between the children and the old patriarch, though no one dared link it openly to the mother or to the nature of the relationships hidden within the family. Even casual comments about their behavior hinted at something beyond normal upbringing, an intensity in their gaze, a stillness in moments where play would have been expected, and an innate understanding of the family's unspoken rules. The children seemed to carry with them a weight far heavier than their years, an invisible inheritance that marked them as both ordinary and profoundly abnormal. The community's response was a mixture of fascination and fear. Some attempted to rationalize what they observed as coincidence, attributing it to genetics in general or to the isolation of life in the mountains. Others, more perceptive, recognized that the pattern pointed toward something deliberate, something cultivated over years and generations. Stories circulated of neighbors who had glimpsed moments of unusual interaction between the children and the patriarch, touches that lingered too long, looks that conveyed knowledge too mature for a child, obedience that bordered on instinct. These incidents were never acted upon, the risk of speaking out was too high, and the implications too terrifying to confront. As the children aged, the differences became more pronounced, feeding the rumors that had begun as faint whispers. Their presence alone seemed to challenge the ordinary rules of the settlement, and those who lived nearby carried a quiet dread whenever the family was near. Even casual observers, passing hunters or travelers who stumbled into the edges of the territory, could sense an intangible strangeness, as if the family existed slightly out of step with the natural order. The repeated traits, the mirrored behaviors, and the uncanny familiarity with the patriarch were pieces of a puzzle that everyone could see but no one could name, forming an invisible thread that bound the children to the darkest and most secret corners of their lineage. When authorities finally attempted to investigate the settlement, they found themselves confronting obstacles that seemed almost deliberately engineered by the land itself. Roads ended abruptly at dense thickets of trees, footpaths twisted unpredictably into hidden hollows, and steep ridges made even short distances feel like treacherous journeys. Maps proved unreliable, satellite images misleading, and local directions were vague at best. Those who ventured too close often returned shaken, speaking of shadows that seemed to follow them, of sounds that carried through the trees but had no source, and of an oppressive silence that swallowed every attempt at clarity. Even seasoned lawmen, used to tracking fugitives and unraveling criminal networks, felt a growing unease that bordered on superstition. Inside the settlement, the people were ready. Generations of living apart from outside oversight had honed an instinct for concealment. Windows were covered or angled to obscure view, doors shut tightly and locked with latches unfamiliar to outsiders, and visitors were met with rehearsed indifference. Questions were answered vaguely or redirected entirely, and the slightest insistence met with a collective coldness that made interrogators reconsider their approach. It became clear that this was not mere avoidance, but an organized effort to ensure that nothing damaging ever reached beyond the forest. Even those who had been born elsewhere and married into the settlement understood the consequences of curiosity. Silence was expected, compliance mandatory, and deviation could lead to isolation or ostracism. Witnesses who might have spoken had either disappeared, left the area quietly, or been persuaded through fear or loyalty to remain silent. The stories that had existed for decades were deliberately buried, and anyone attempting to resurrect them quickly realized that the settlement operated like a self-contained world, governed by its own rules. Those rules ensured that even the most determined outsiders found themselves facing a wall of secrecy too thick to penetrate. Conversations were monitored subtly, messages never left unobserved, and anyone showing signs of interest in the darker truths of the family was gently but unmistakably discouraged. Investigators documented the homes, recorded interviews, and tried to follow the pattern of births and lineage, but the forest itself seemed to conspire against clarity. Trails would vanish, records were incomplete or altered, and memories conflicted in ways that felt intentional. It was as if the settlement existed in parallel with the outside world, obeying its own laws, and punishing those who attempted to bridge the two. Every attempt to uncover the truth was met with resistance, both physical and psychological, forcing outsiders to recognize that they were not merely investigating a family, but confronting an environment built entirely around concealment. By the time authorities began piecing together fragments of evidence, they understood that their work was only partially possible. The settlement's isolation, the community's cohesion, and the pervasive influence of fear and tradition had combined to form a barrier that no law could penetrate fully, leaving them with the unsettling knowledge that some secrets were guarded not just by people, but by the very woods themselves. Decades of silence finally cracked when one of the surviving descendants decided to speak, breaking a family tradition that had protected the darkest truths for generations. Her voice was hesitant at first, trembling as though the words themselves carried the weight of an unspoken curse, but with each sentence, the hidden history of the family began to emerge. She described a childhood steeped in fear and obedience, where even minor infractions were met with cold reprimand or subtle threats. The rules of the household were unwritten but absolute, instilled from the earliest age, and the children learned quickly that questions were dangerous, curiosity punishable. It was a world where the normal boundaries between parent and child, grandparent and grandchild, had been twisted into something unrecognizable. Her recollections revealed details that had long been suspected but never confirmed. She spoke of the old patriarch's constant presence, of the way he monitored the children's lives with an intensity that went beyond care or authority, and of the mother's quiet resignation to the unnatural circumstances imposed upon her own offspring. Even as a child, she sensed the irregularity of their family structure, the tension between the innocence of youth and the oppressive weight of secrecy. The adult world of the settlement had always treated these matters as normal, but her perspective, shaped by exposure to the outside world later in life, allowed her to recognize the exploitation and moral corruption that had been normalized behind closed doors. The stories she told were not abstract or generalized, they were vivid, specific, and terrifyingly ordinary. She recalled evenings when the children were sent to separate rooms, whispers carried through walls, and instructions given with an authority that could not be questioned. She remembered the way the family enforced loyalty through fear rather than affection, shaping behaviors and allegiances with subtle manipulations that no outsider could perceive at first glance. The psychological environment created a self-perpetuating cycle of silence and compliance, ensuring that each generation reinforced the system rather than challenging it. Her revelations did more than confirm suspicions, they humanized the hidden trauma, giving voice to the children whose lives had been molded by the dark legacy of their own bloodline. By speaking out, she illuminated the mechanisms of control, the unspoken rules that had allowed the abuse to continue unchecked, and the emotional and psychological scars carried by those who had been too young or too powerless to resist. Her testimony made clear that the horror of the family's history was not only a matter of lineage or genetics, but of a carefully maintained social structure, enforced over decades, designed to shield the truth from both the outside world and the conscience of those living within it. Through her courage, the story shifted from rumor and speculation to documented human experience, revealing that the settlement's greatest secrecy had never been the landscape or the isolation itself, but the way its people had learned to protect and perpetuate a reality far darker than anyone outside could imagine. The moment genetic evidence entered the story, the unspoken fears of generations transformed into undeniable truth. DNA testing, conducted quietly and under strict confidentiality, confirmed what had long been suspected but never proven. The children shared a biological link with the patriarch that was impossible under conventional family structures. The analysis traced the lineage directly, exposing that the man who had dominated the family through authority and intimidation was, in fact, the father of the children, and also their mother's grandfather. The revelation was clinical in its precision, cold and factual, yet its implications were so horrifying that they rippled through anyone who dared consider them. For decades, speculation had hung in the air like smoke, but now the patterns etched in faces, gestures, and mannerisms had irrefutable confirmation. The settlement, long accustomed to a system of fear and silence, could no longer hide behind assumptions. What had been whispered among neighbors as odd or unnatural now carried the weight of scientific certainty. The children's uncanny features, the eyes, the jawlines, the expressions that mirrored their grandfather were not anomalies or coincidence, they were the tangible proof of a generational distortion that had been nurtured in secrecy. Even those who had dismissed rumors as gossip could no longer escape the reality that the bloodline itself bore the evidence of abuse, manipulation, and isolation. The genetic confirmation rendered denials meaningless, leaving only the stark acknowledgement of a family legacy that had been twisted inward on itself. Authorities and researchers alike approached the results with a mixture of disbelief and horror, struggling to reconcile the cold, factual data with the moral and social implications. The findings demanded recognition not just of biological connections, but of a systematic failure to protect children, a long-term concealment of acts that would be condemned universally if fully understood. For the settlement, this was more than evidence, it was an indictment of generations of complicity. The patriarch's role was no longer an abstract influence, no longer a story passed down in hushed tones, it was a demonstrable, genetic truth, leaving the community's moral framework shattered and the boundaries of acceptable behavior forever redefined. Even outside the immediate circle of the family, the genetic confirmation resonated, altering the perception of the settlement itself. What had been viewed as a remote, insular community with strange customs became something darker, a locus of deliberate concealment, a place where human impulses had been warped into a secret so profound that only science could finally unveil it. The revelation did more than clarify relationships, it illuminated the magnitude of the deception, the calculated preservation of secrecy, and the terrifying extent to which isolation had allowed a monstrous pattern to repeat itself unchecked, leaving a legacy of trauma inscribed not in stories or rumors, but in the very DNA of those who had survived it. When the case was finally documented and the evidence compiled, the story did not conclude with justice or resolution, but with a question that lingered heavier than any verdict: how many other families, hidden in the same remote folds of the Appalachian wilderness, carried secrets so dark that no outsider could ever know? The settlement itself, long insulated by mountains, forests, and generations of silence, had acted as a natural vault, preserving a truth that the outside world might have considered impossible. Even with the genetic evidence, testimonies, and fragmented records, investigators understood that what had been uncovered was likely only the surface, a glimpse into patterns that had been quietly repeated elsewhere. The notion that this isolated horror was unique began to feel naive, almost comforting, but the patterns were familiar enough to suggest that isolation and secrecy could incubate similar distortions of human behavior in countless other corners of the country. The thought was terrifying because it reframed the entire story. It was no longer just about one family, one patriarch, or one woman. It was about the mechanisms that allow abuse and moral corruption to persist under the radar of societal oversight. Isolation, fear, and obedience had combined in this settlement to create a microcosm where unnatural acts could be normalized and concealed, but the same ingredients existed elsewhere: forests, hills, and valleys where communities remained untouchable by law or morality as defined by the outside world. For those who studied or attempted to intervene, the case became a lesson in the fragility of social structures, showing that human cruelty could thrive quietly when given room and protection. Survivors carried the burden of both knowledge and silence, their lives marked by trauma that was compounded by the impossibility of fully exposing it. Even now, decades later, whispers continued to circulate beyond the settlement, fueled by curiosity, fear, and the need to reconcile what had happened. Researchers and authorities realized that while one family had been brought into the light, countless others might remain deliberately hidden, protected by the same combination of geography, tradition, and generational obedience. The forest, in essence, had become a guardian of secrets, its trees and ridges as much a part of the concealment as the people themselves. The final understanding was unsettling. The settlement's secret, horrifying though it was not an anomaly but a symptom. It represented the potential for human behavior to be warped by isolation and unchecked power, and it served as a stark reminder that for every story brought into daylight, countless others might remain buried. Even with the most rigorous investigation, the woods, the family, and the silence had left questions that could never be fully answered, leaving behind a legacy of dread, suspicion, and the unnerving certainty that the darkest corners of human nature could, and likely did, exist far beyond the reaches of those willing or able to uncover them.